we will start the Q&A from the front row, but after a few minutes, we will open that up to questions from the audience. Ms. King should be here. She, as the senior teacher. Okay, Miss Birch is running late. She's like in the she's like here, but she's stuck in traffic on one. We'll give her a couple minutes. I think she's worth it. Just a little bit of info. This is Mariam's final project. It is 149 pages.
No, there was not any shelf in it. I mean, I guess.
Longest project ever, only being surpassed by her classmate. Row 3, Veronica, who finished at 175.
I don't know. That might be best.
So,
I don't think it's that bad. Yeah.
All right. Let me call Miss King.
It's working.
Andrew King, where are you? We'll put Miss King on the end there, and if Miss Birch, I'll just move the spot for her. Hey, there she is. Hey. You okay?
Yeah.
You what? Passed out? I thought you said I passed out. I'm like, hey! Rosie from Dallas. Look at that. Great outfit, brother. Oh, look at this. This is a green team. You know to pick them right. This is a pretty awesome team. Great timing. We're just on time. Anyone wants to fill in those seats there, and then if people come in late, they can fill in some of the back seats. So,
Are we going to
yeah, we will. It is a great day, academic day for PA. How's the temp, Mariam?
It's fine.
Fine, okay. If we need to adjust the temp, we can turn it down a degree or two if needed. I think we're right on time. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to day 1 of 11 days of Senior Honors Thesis Defenses, year 21 for this. Obviously, we're christening a new room for the defenses here up in the World Language Building. Again, today we're starting off with 2, I don't think it's a stretch to say legendary students, but we'll go down as Hall of Famers, without a doubt, if they don't crash in front of the no pressure. No pressure. Oh, come on, Pram. Come on, you gotta lighten up a bit. Let's see what like. Again, those of you in the audience and soon-to-be thesis students, this is basically a 9-month process, and you'll be selecting topics probably as soon as May when we start having brainstorming session. This is obviously Mariam is going to be attending University of Virginia as a Jefferson Scholar, and so proud of the work she's done over the years from 9th grade on. I know Mr. Simmons isn't with us right now, but I think you had the longest 9th grade paper he's ever read, and so you continued with that trend in 10th and 11th grade with papers that were in excess of 35 pages, and in junior year paper over 40 pages. As some of the audience members heard, this is a 149-page senior thesis. Outstanding piece of research and writing. I know the committee members were thrilled to work with her on this project. And of course, since it was announced last week, she is our valedictorian and #1 in the class of 2023. Let's give it up for Mariam.
Good afternoon. My name is Mariam Parray, and today I'll be presenting my honors senior thesis, The Weaponization of Life, an Analysis of Martyrdom, Hunger Strikes, and Self-Immolation. I'll first begin by discussing some of my most important sources. First, Starve and Immolate by Banu Bargu not only convinced me that there was enough information out there on this topic, but also contained the key terminology, namely the phrase, the weaponization of life. It also introduced me to the Turkish case study and different lenses I could use to analyze this topic. The next book, Dying to Win by Robert Pape, served as a foundation for my second chapter, along with Mia Bloom's book, Dying to Kill. Both opened my eyes to the inherently logical nature of suicide terrorism and the history of martyrdom that preceded it. Finally, Refusal to Eat by Neon Shah covered many of the case studies in my third chapter and helped me understand the nature of protest and how it is used to combat injustice. The weaponization of life is defined as the tactic of resorting to corporeal and existential practices of struggle based on the technique of self-destruction in order to make a political statement or advance political goals. Offensive weaponization of life means killing oneself and others, while defensive weaponization of life means killing just oneself. 3 types of weaponization of life are studied in this thesis: martyrdom, hunger strikes, and self-immolation, although more do exist. There are 10 case studies throughout this thesis, 3 per each example of weaponization of life, and 1 overarching example. These case studies were selected based on their influence on the evolution of the tactic, their success, and sometimes their defiance of expected patterns. The first step to understanding the weaponization of life is that it is not the same as suicide. When we think of suicide, we most often think of what sociologist Emile Durkheim defined as egoistic suicide, when one is far removed from society and seeking to escape. The weaponization of life is nothing like egoistic suicide, for it is not associated with mental health issues or personal problems. It is about advancing a greater cause. Thus, the weaponization of life most closely aligns with what Durkheim defined as altruistic suicide, but even this does not entirely recognize how the cause may be more important than social integration itself. To begin my chapter on martyrdom and suicide terrorism, I first studied religious martyrdom. Religious texts like the Bible and the Quran recount countless stories of men entering battle and dying for their religion, being praised as martyrs afterward. In these cases, martyrdom manifested as a normal occurrence due to battle and a method of death that was praised rather than shunned. Martyrdom also existed in a more unconventional form with a few early terrorist organizations, such as the Ismaili Assassins. This group rebelled against the Sunni state and assassinated key leaders with a dagger, killing themselves upon completing their mission. The more conventional form of religious martyrdom eventually transitioned to a more nationalistic cause. The most famous example of this is the kamikaze pilots during World War II who killed themselves as they crashed their planes into U.S. naval vessels. This transition marked the use of martyrdom not just as a possibility in battle, but rather something to be used intentionally, which leads us to modern-day suicide terrorism. Today, suicide terrorism is defined as situations in which the attacker does not expect to survive the mission and often employs a method of attack that requires his or her death in order to succeed. As seen in this graph, suicide attacks have not only increased in number over time, but have also comprised a greater proportion of attacks used by terrorist organizations. While the data here ends in 2013, it is clear that there's an upward trend. There are 2 types of organizational motivations for suicide terrorism: strategic and social logic. Strategic logic argues that such attacks are immensely effective in achieving the collective cause. Suicide terrorist organizations are most often trying to convince a government to change its policy, make a foreign state withdraw from their perceived homeland, or gain autonomy themselves. Suicide attacks compensate for weaker military power, kill key targets without needing an escape plan, and often do damage at a lower cost. On the other hand, social logic highlights how terrorist organizations are not only trying to create instability, but also incite fear while maintaining legitimacy. Suicide attacks send a message to the opposing society attempting to break their will to resist. Within the terrorist organization itself, the use of suicide terrorism allows readers to create rhetoric around martyrdom that helps increase loyalty to the cause. While there are many individual motivations as pictured here, I'll only be focusing on a few. First, it is important to note that while psychology influences suicide terrorism, suicide terrorists are not mentally unstable. They may hold previous trauma or create dissociative defenses that help them carry out the attack, but they still do so with reason. Second, some of the personal reasons behind suicide terrorism are seeking revenge or compensating for an otherwise insignificant life. One does not have to have a direct grievance in order to have motivation in order to have revenge as a motivation. Instead, they can be angered on behalf of something that has occurred in their community. Finally, it is important to note that religion is not necessarily a motivation, but rather a facilitator. This means that organizations use religious texts to justify their actions and thereby convince people to join, but is not their primary reason for doing so. One of my 3 case studies for suicide terrorism was the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. Located in Sri Lanka, the minority Tamil ethnic group felt oppressed by the majority Sinhalese. Although initially nonviolent methods were used to combat this discrimination, a more militant generation led to the rise of the Tamil Tigers in the 1970s. It is important to note that the Tamil Tigers were based upon a legitimate cause, but used violence as their solution. They were not religious, instead nationalistic, and alienated some moderate Tamils through their use of indiscriminate violence. However, those who were close to the cause received many beneficial social services. Until their defeat in May 2009, 70,000 people died in the conflict against the Tamil Tigers. The group is especially known for its use of high-level assassinations, such as the death of former Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. In the broader context of suicide terrorism, the Tamil Tigers are known for pioneering the suicide bomb jacket, in addition to the use of women in suicide attacks, inspiring other terrorist organizations. The second form of weaponization of life studied in my thesis is hunger strikes. While hunger strikes are said to have existed for centuries in some countries, the first strike of international significance occurred in Russia in the late 19th century. Here, imprisoned exiles and political convicts began a strike against carceral oppression. From there, news of the strike spread to other countries where it was adopted as a tactic. Hunger strikes are unique in that they allow the actor to control the communication process. They have time to adjust their strategy based on the enemy's reaction, the ability to conduct negotiations, and a chance to revoke death. In fact, most hunger strikes do not end up in death. Instead, the actor just uses its possibility as pressure against the authorities. My case study for this chapter focuses on the British and American suffragettes who used hunger striking after being imprisoned. Beginning with Mariam Wallace Dunlop in the United Kingdom, the hunger strike was adopted more widely by the suffragette movement as the government began to quickly release those who were on strike. After a few months, however, the British government grew frustrated with the practice and eventually resorted to force feeding. Stories of harsh treatment created the impression that the authorities were responsible for all of the strikers' suffering, allowing the suffragettes to convince the public. The tactic of hunger striking eventually made its way to the United States with American suffragette Alice Paul. Paul and her fellow suffragettes faced equally brutal experiences of force feeding, and eventually they succeeded in placing enough pressure on the government to get themselves released. While it is unclear whether hunger strikes were the main reason for suffragettes eventually gaining the right to vote for women, as many people claim it was women's contributions to World War I, the suffragettes' use of the hunger strike put the tactic on the world stage for many others to emulate. The final form of the weaponization of life studied in this thesis is self-immolation. While self-immolation technically means any sacrifice for a collective cause, it has come to be associated most commonly with autocremation, or lighting oneself on fire, which is the main focus of the case studies used in this thesis. Self-immolation holds an advantage, particularly in comparison to hunger strikes, due to its clear visibility in the public eye. This benefit is diluted by the fact that the immediate death of a protester prevents them from controlling the integrity and dissemination of their message. Compared to hunger strikes, which have arguably become an acceptable form of protest, autocremation seemed to generate less sympathy and awareness, perhaps due to the instinctive response to look away in a self-defense-like mechanism. On June 11, 1963, Buddhist monk Thich Quang Duc burned himself to death in a Saigon intersection to protest the persecution of Buddhists by the minority Catholic South Vietnamese regime. Sitting in the lotus position, he remained in a state of meditation as nuns and monks blocked fire engines from dousing his body. Unlike previous historical instances of self-immolation, Quang Duc's sacrifice was not isolated, instead prompting waves of self-immolation across Asia and even the United States. In doing so, his self-immolation fundamentally reshaped protest tactics worldwide. Those who followed in Quang Duc's footsteps did so to express concern over the war. One such person was Norman Morrison, a Quaker alarmed by the indiscriminate violence occurring in Vietnam. Morrison drove to Washington, D.C., and burned himself to death near the window of Robert S. McNamara, the Secretary of Defense at the time. He took his baby daughter Emily with him, but she was separated before he was engulfed in flames and surprisingly escaped unharmed. Both Quang Duc's and Morrison's deaths may not have directly contributed to the end of the Vietnam War, but the deaths of such self-immolators must be counted alongside the other bodies that returned home from the war as factors that made the U.S. unwilling to fight anymore. While I will not go into full detail on one of my other self-immolation case studies, Tibet, I will address it in the context of the role of authorities and institutions. Beginning in 2009, a wave of self-immolations occurred in Tibet, protesting oppression by the Chinese government. In 2012, Stephen Prothero, an American religious scholar, posted an article criticizing the Dalai Lama for his relatively neutral stance. This begs the question of what authority figures and institutions should do when members of their community engage in self-sacrifice: condemn, condone, or remain silent. However, the issue with Prothero's and other such stances criticizing the authority is the Western gaze and neocolonialist mindset from which they approach the Tibetan nationalist struggle. The Western media fail to uplift the Tibetan voice, romanticize the region, and ignore the self-actualization that comes along with self-immolation. In doing so, they further dehumanize the Tibetan people, depriving them of the same agency taken away by the Chinese state. Instead of condemning the actions by authorities and institutions from which these people are a part of, the focus by the international community should be on condemning the source of oppression. This same issue is seen in another case study of this thesis, the Turkish hunger strikes of the early 2000s. An article by Scott Anderson in the New York Times Magazine focuses on the angelic nature of a female hunger striker he met, how he tried to get her to stop fasting, and general disregard for how the people around him wanted to be perceived. Perhaps the biggest issue with the Western gaze is that the narrow view of success as legislative or political change, when in reality, some of these actors seek intangible successes regarding their identity. The purpose of this thesis is to understand the weaponization of life, but this is not possible if one holds such a narrow view of the phenomenon with the Western gaze. As we look to address the future of the weaponization of life, it's important to address vulnerabilities and patterns. For both suicide terrorism and suicide protests, it has been argued that democracies are the most susceptible. However, there has been a lack of information and cases of conflicting studies in both cases. Regardless, democracies hold a unique role when addressing these acts, given that they theoretically prioritize upholding human rights in their response. As for its effectiveness, suicide attacks allow terrorist organizations to achieve more than they would otherwise. As seen here, suicide attacks are more lethal in terms of average fatalities and average wounded compared to any other option with terrorist organizations. Meanwhile, suicide protests have the ability to reignite movements that would otherwise die out. While only a few suicide protests have had political consequences out of thousands that have occurred, once again, we cannot limit success to solely tangible consequences, although they are important indicators. Going forward, the weaponization of life will undoubtedly remain part of the global repertoire of resistance tactics. Studies show that past suicide terrorism attacks globally make the strategy more likely, meaning the tactic will continue to be used in the future. As for suicide protests, sociologist David Phillips published a study documenting how well-publicized suicides lead to a spike in the overall number of suicides, naming this phenomenon the Werther effect. This essentially speaks to the imitation that occurs after suicide protests, and thus with social media, it is clear that suicide protests will continue, perhaps in an amplified manner. One moral dilemma with the defensive weaponization of life is that actors are typically seeking a better life, but are also willing to die for it, creating a stark contradiction. However, the right to life cannot merely be simplified to the right to breathe and exist. Instead, it is only meaningful when preserved in conjunction with other fundamental rights. Since the main purpose of the weaponization of life is not death, it cannot be considered a violation of the right to life. While seemingly about the right to die, the weaponization of life is instead about seeking agency, meaning, and a sense of humanity for the individual. As written here, suicide protesters are not in search of death, but rather looking for real life. The morality of these acts often comes into question as well. The moral value of the weaponization of life depends on three things: the intention, the act itself, and the aftermath. For the act itself, all acts are inherently violent, but whether or not the harm is restricted to the individual affects its moral standing. While the actor cannot control the aftermath once they are dead, they do hold a responsibility to ensure that their message, whatever it may be, is preserved as it is intended to minimize moral culpability for imitation. Jean-Paul Sartre argues that everyone must consider their actions as recommendations to others, and thus even these actors should recognize what they are suggesting to the entire world. Likewise, the media also holds a moral responsibility to ensure that these acts are interpreted and responded to in the way they were intended. Understanding of the Werther effect has raised concerns about how the media presents and inadvertently encourages suicide or self-sacrifice. Nonetheless, the media must still report on these acts, ensuring that the actor's life and message do not go to waste, but with careful representation that neither delegitimizes the actor's sacrifice nor encourages drastic action. Finally, our role as bystanders demands that we respond to public self-sacrifice with attentiveness and remembrance. We hold an obligation to the dead, not only to remember what they did, but who they are. Whether or not we choose to recognize this duty, ignoring this obligation disavows not only the dead, but their deeds, allowing them to fall by the wayside into a void of actions that never occurred. Remembering those who resort to the weaponization of life is not only about telling or carrying on an individual story, but also a story about humanity, our capabilities, rights, and defiance of limits. Simply pausing to remember these stories may not spark the demanded change, but it rehumanizes an action we are quick to turn away from out of confusion and fear. As anthropologist Karen Andriolo states, if we turn the other way, protest suicides are killed twice, once by their own hands and once by the silence of our imagination. Thank you.
Very easy question to start out with. Why did you choose this topic, and what did you find most challenging as you went through this entire process over the last 8 to 9 months?
So this project was built off of things I had kind of previously learned about in classes or written about previously. My sophomore year, I wrote a paper on the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and a key part of that topic was the Irish Republican hunger strikes in the 1980s. So that's mainly where the idea came from. The most difficult part of the project was probably synthesizing like different information and tying it to like the philosophy and ethics of the weaponization of life.
Primary narratives, was it difficult to find, again, people that are involved in these political movements, whether it be the Tamil Tigers or Hezbollah, a group you mentioned in your thesis but didn't have time to discuss today? Were you able to integrate enough primary narratives? Is that something you felt that you would have liked to attempted to do more of, and what were you able to at different times?
I think my primary narratives are probably the strongest for hunger strikes. Generally speaking, the most information is out there on suicide terrorism, but the information for suicide terrorism is at a different angle compared to the other forms of weaponization of life that I studied.
To my colleagues here.
Well, that speaks to the Western gaze. I know in your conclusion, you started the conclusion with Western gaze, and I was so intrigued with that being kind of the lens through which you began the conclusion. And I was thinking about it then as you were talking about the morality, the Werther effect, and I was thinking about like how we can reconcile the issue with the Western gaze with the essential, I'm assuming, and I think you even argued essential media attention for efficacy, especially for defensive weaponization of life. So hunger strikes and self-immolation. And is the problem specifically international news outlets, American news outlets, and how can news outlets do justice to these important stories while minimizing the Western gaze and then possibly the Werther effect? I just asked like several questions. This is where my mind was going. I don't know if you remember in my notes, I kept on being like, well, what about the Western gaze? Because you started me with that idea and I was kind of fixated with it and very, it was very compelling.
So with the problem with Tibet, which is what I used to introduce the Western gaze, was at that point in time, it was possible to contact Tibetans about what they wanted to say on the issue, but instead they focused on the American perspective of it when they could have been interviewing Tibetans and asking them how they felt about the oppression. So I think that's the first step, is that when there are people protesting, like the government or authority view is not what's needed. It's these people who are seeking agency, and by not letting them speak, we're denying them more agency. In terms of the Werther effect, I think once Phillips's study was published in the 1980s, there is more of a fear of talking about them than there is allowing these people to speak. And I think that presents a concern. But with the use of social media, people are able to get their voices out there, maybe not in those conventional like news outlet forms.
Was there a question about publishing the actual images of self-immolation and autocronation? If I'm just curious if that was something that came up.
So his study mainly focused on like different ways of quantifying it. So it was like number of newspaper pages or airtime. I don't necessarily know about the images.
So I want to piggyback off of Ms. Birch also because I thought that was fascinating aspect of your thesis, especially from me having a journalism background as well. So did you find at all that when it comes to the media's role, was there anything, especially thinking about how our modern media works and this constant, instant, 24/7 access that we have, how did that, or did you find anything that shows how that affects the public's view of the weaponization of life, that we constantly have this access to media? Does that bring it more to light, or does it actually bury that? Like you said, how sometimes the media can neglect the actual person's meaning and role in what they do.
I think generally speaking, it has brought more attention, but sometimes it's not bringing attention to what that person intended, not like their specific message.
Okay. And so then with that, the other part that I found fascinating was your case studies and what you had to say about the hunger strikes and this idea of, especially with the suffragettes, how they relied on the empathy of other people in order to get their message across. I compare that then to also our modern lens. Has the effectiveness of hunger strikes decreased in that ability to cause change simply because we see more nationalistic viewpoints rather than global viewpoints, and we see so many of these hunger strikes happening abroad and not really within our own borders, or that it's not really reported on as much?
I think as a whole, the weaponization of life is based on the fact that only humans can sacrifice their life in such a way. It's inherently built upon emotion. For suicide terrorism, this means working off of the idea of fear, but also belonging. Mm-hmm. And then for the defensive weaponization of life, it is about that empathy, like the fact that people can relate to suffering, hunger, things like that. I think the problem today is that when we see these acts maybe occurring somewhere else, we're not thinking about the fact that these people are also human, and that's what they're attempting to regain through their act.
All right, I'm going to change it up a little bit. So over and over again, we see this struggle between a bigger power who has access to more resources versus a smaller power who is often being oppressed by the bigger power. In almost all cases, the oppressed employ weaponization of life against the oppressor. So I have a few questions that stem from this. So my first one, which you actually touched on quite a bit in your presentation, but can you briefly explain why the weaponization of life proves so effective against a group, organization, or country that has twice, if not more, the resources and force?
Yeah, so for suicide terrorism, this is really based on like the organizational logic behind it. I referenced this earlier, but like democracies cannot respond in the same way that terrorist organizations act. They have an obligation to act in a certain way. So by employing people's lives, they automatically gain an advantage over a higher power, and they are within the group. They are able to say this is the greatest form of sacrifice, and they increase loyalty. For hunger strikes and self-immolation, it's once again built off of that idea of empathy. Hunger strikes always place the blame on the authority. And even if it's resorted to force feeding, that's actually more helpful in some ways. It worked out for the suffragettes. But when you look at cases like Guantanamo Bay, it's a way of silencing them, which is why force feeding is considered unethical in almost all cases.
This leads me to my second question. So although upon first look, it seems like the instances of self-immolation amongst the students in India present a challenge to this power struggle, because this time it's the oppressors that employ weaponization of life. So how do these students fit into the power struggle model? And what does this say about the reality of oppression versus the perception of oppression?
So like a brief explanation for those in the room, because I didn't include the India case study in my presentation, but in 1990, there was a series of self-immolations in India, about 200, by middle class, upper caste students who were upset about affirmative action policies for lower castes. And this case study stands out because it's not those who are the most oppressed that are resorting to the weaponization of life. And this speaks to the idea that one does not actually have to be oppressed. They just have to feel as if they're being oppressed. The weaponization of life is about attempting to regain agency. These students felt as if they didn't have a greater quota in the education system, they wouldn't have a good life or control over where their life was going. So they try to use the defensive weaponization of life to regain that agency. And it's also important to note that like a lot of these acts pertain to the government. So in that way, they were still not at the top. They still had the government over them, and that's who they were trying to convince.
Phenomenal job on your presentation and your research. Of course, I haven't had the opportunity to read your thesis yet, but I love the comparative case studies and your approach to this topic. Did you find that, we just came out of our big culture unit, still kind of at the end of it in human geography. Did you find that there were any kind of cultural traits amongst these various groups that you looked at that would make a particular region or country or a group of people more likely to, go through this process of self-immolation or suicide in order to make a statement such as this?
Yeah, so I would say with hunger strikes and self-immolation, there is a lot of like history behind that. When I talked about the hunger strikes in Northern Ireland, there is a history of that there being used. Sociologist Michael Biggs also found that there was a correlation between self-immolation and Buddhism and Hinduism, just because that has been used in some cases in the religion to express like devotion. But it's not necessarily that the religion encourages, more that it's been accepted as a sacred thing and people are now using it in a different form.
And kind of to go off of that, did you find any kind of stark differences between the offensive and defensive kind of approaches to suicide in this way? Culturally or independently, I guess?
I would say culturally, not necessarily, but there is a tendency to try to find those patterns within suicide terrorism and relegate it to a certain group, but that is not necessarily true because suicide terrorism, once again, religion is not a motivation more than it is a facilitator, and that could really be applied through any religion.
Excellent.
I've got one more question, then maybe a few from the audience. Role of technology. Because martyrdom operations now are relying so much more on technology and advances in this area, has this made martyrdom operations more highly successful, more popularized, especially in the last 20 years since the war on terror began?
So I would say technology as a whole has accelerated the weaponization of life, both offensive and defensive. In terms of offensive, suicide terrorist organizations can really play into those individual motivations I discussed earlier through the use of propaganda. And now they have an equal advantage compared to governments, as so many people use social media. And you see that with Al-Shabaab in Somalia. And then with the defensive weaponization of life, the most obvious example tied to social media is Mohamed Bouaziz's self-immolation in Tunisia. And it spread across the Arab world due to social media and resulted in one imitation, but also political consequences.
Let's open it up to the audience, maybe for 2 or 3 questions, and then turn over to Josh. I'll let you choose who you want to call on.
Sarah?
Hi, so did you see like a difference in efficacy between like suicide terrorism and just terrorism that doesn't end up killing the agent?
Yeah, so I had a graph on there earlier, but generally speaking, suicide attacks are the most effective attack that a terrorist organization could use. Obviously, there is a point where you can't always be using suicide attacks because that is diminishing your group itself. But generally speaking, those are the best in terms of inciting fear, but also the amount of damage. Nico.
So like regarding the role of the media and how like there's so many like self-immolations and other forms of weaponization of life that are like presented to like the populations that are like meant to see this. Does like the mass amount of self-immolations coupled with like the idea that like as you mentioned, it's kind of human nature to just turn away and not really like consider the message that they're spreading. Does this create like desensitization to like these self-immolations and their message, and like does it cause like these groups or just people that are like trying to spread their message to adopt other forms of weaponization as well?
I think generally speaking, one, we tend to turn away from them, but then even when it is included in the media, it's not presented in that correct form. Like the Western gaze is either veiling what is trying to be conveyed, or the media is just hesitant to present it overall. So yes, I think we've been desensitized in the sense that we don't really understand that there's humans behind this. I think even with suicide terrorism, if you look at Tamil Tigers, for example, to me, it makes sense why they did this. The fact that they were being discriminated against, they felt a sense of oppression. We should be able to understand the causes behind this and realize why they're doing it. Now, what tactic they resort to, that's a bit more difficult to understand, but we need to understand that humans are searching for a sense of agency and ways to defy oppression. Jonathan?
So in the many instances where life has been weaponized, especially in defensive, in the case of defensive tactics, do you personally think that, well, the use of like mass media to like spread these instances to a greater audience obviously has been able to publicize it more, but it's also led to the deterioration of the message somewhat. Do you personally think that it is worth it in some cases for it to reach that greater audience, or do you think there's a line that shouldn't be crossed?
I mean, you alluded to it, but like media is both good and bad. It is giving these actors a chance to speak the way they want to, but other people can also distort the message. I think that right now, democracies are not always sticking to their commitment to uphold human rights. And I think the most obvious example is Guantanamo Bay, as the US isn't giving detainees their proper rights. So I think in that case, when those detainees have access to the lawyers who then have access to social media, for now, media, I think, is a slightly more positive tool just because we don't have governments that are doing the right thing. Blake.
So I know you discussed how, especially with self-immolation, but mainly with like terrorism, like bombing, about like suicide bombings, how there can often be like a lack of empathy for the cause whenever you have violence that is either very brutal or like targets many civilians as well. How would you say that lack of empathy stands as a roadblock to like that perpetrator's mission?
I think overall the lack of empathy is why we're not able to like resolve those issues behind it. If we relegate like suicide terrorism to a specific group or cause, then we're not understanding why people are actually doing this, because it has to do with a specific mission. And like I said before, in many cases, they are legitimate causes. Of course, we cannot necessarily justify their use of violence, but addressing that this isn't some mental health issue or psychological predisposition is the first point. Those people are still human, and if they've been radicalized in some form, we need to find a way to de-radicalize them as well.
One more question.
Any more questions? Caitlin?
How has advancements in technology made suicide terrorism easier or harder?
I would say overall it has been an advantage, as I was talking about earlier. Propaganda is probably the biggest thing, just because terrorist organizations now have access to radios, social media, television, etc. And so that can seep into the minds of people. But then also in terms of weapons, it's more easily accessible to get their hands on what they need, and it doesn't really take much to make a bomb or any other sort of effective weapon. So this overall technology is in advantage of those who want to use the weaponization of life.
Thank you. Committee, let's get a photo up there. Let's put your opening slide up. And then Mom and Dad will get a photo in a second. Good turnout. Look at this crowd. King, you want to get this photo? Oh, yeah. Let's put you, we want the slide to show.
Yeah, we want the slide.
Oh, yeah. Let's.
Please be where I need to be.
Yeah,
King, help us
right
out.
over here. There we go. Yeah.
Is that it?
Honestly, I think it might, I don't know if y'all can like see it there, because the light coming in is
Do we want to? I think we can see the front of the court. Because
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Okay, and then you and
Yeah,
I can be right.
right here.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's better, I can see your faces. 1, 2, 3.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
I was
Did we get it?
Mom, Dad?
Yes, absolutely. One, two, three.